At 85, Frank Sinatra's former manager finally broke the silence that had lasted more than half a century. Sitting in a dim hotel bar in Palm Springs, his voice cracked as he said the one sentence every biographer had chased for decades: they didn't love each other. They tried to survive each other. It was the first time anyone close to Sinatra dared to speak of the nights when love turned violent, when tenderness became ammunition, and when Hollywood's most dazzling couple tore themselves apart under the spotlight. To the public, Frank and Ava were a fever dream made of jazz and perfume, the voice and the goddess. The man who could sing any heart open and the woman who could stop any room cold. They were photographed as if the world belonged to them, his arm around her waist, her smile like a dare. But inside the mansion on Linden Drive, where crystal glasses clinked and reporters waited outside the gates, the same passion that had built their legend began to rot it from within. The manager's confession painted a darker picture. He spoke of nights filled with slammed doors and shattered records, of Frank calling her from New York at 3 a.m., only to scream, "Who's with you?" before hanging up, of Ava throwing a diamond bracelet into the pool, whispering, "Let the world drown with it," and of mornings when both showed up to movie sets bruised, pretending the marks were makeup accidents. Fame covered everything until it didn't. In 1953, when Frank's career faltered and Ava soared, love turned into a scoreboard. Every headline about her was a wound. Every ovation she earned felt like an insult to his fading pride. He drank to forget. She drank to remember. And together they created a storm too loud for reason to enter. Their friends called it passion. Their enemies called it madness. But those who witnessed it up close, the assistants, the drivers, the maids who picked up the broken glass, called it something else: war. Now, decades later, as the old manager wiped his eyes and whispered about the night Ava left Madrid without saying goodbye, his final words lingered like smoke over the table. Love wasn't their problem, he said softly. It was that neither of them knew how to surrender. Outside, a song played from a nearby jukebox, "I've Got You Under My Skin." The melody drifted through the night like a ghost, still trying to make peace with itself. And the question remained, as haunting now as it was then. What happens when two people love each other so fiercely that the only way to stay alive is to destroy each other, to the public? Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner were the embodiment of mid-century perfection, the golden couple who turned every photograph into a love song. In newsreels, they looked untouchable. His tuxedo gleamed under flashbulbs, her emerald dress shimmered like a promise. Reporters wrote about the ultimate Hollywood romance, a marriage of voice and beauty, of jazz and danger. They appeared at premieres hand in hand, trading witty remarks that seemed improvised but were, more often than not, carefully rehearsed. Each gesture was choreographed to protect an illusion that love could survive fame if the camera loved it enough. The manufactured dream. Publicists at MGM worked overtime to sell the myth. Ava was to be the femme fatale who had tamed the world's most famous bachelor, Frank, the reformed crooner who had finally found salvation in her arms. Studio memos dictated what they wore, how close they stood, even the angle at which their hands should meet. Ava, with her low voice and feline grace, played the part perfectly. Frank, never comfortable being anyone's creation, tried to match her calm with a swagger that fooled everyone but her. To their audience, he was the confident king of the microphone. To her, he was a man terrified that applause might be the only real love he would ever receive. They became the soundtrack of post-war desire, the working-class boy from Hoboken and the Carolina beauty who could silence a crowd by lighting a cigarette. America needed their story, two stars in a country dreaming of glamour after years of grief. And so every magazine cover, every press interview, became another brick in the monument to an idea that love, if dazzling enough, could erase pain. The first cracks. But the illusion began to flicker almost as soon as it was projected. When Frank's record sales slipped in the early 1,950 seconds, the press that once adored him turned cruel. Headlines called him washed up. Columnists mocked his temper tantrums. Ava, meanwhile, was becoming Hollywood's most coveted leading lady. Each new role brought awards, travel, adoration, and distance. At first, Frank tried to follow her from set to set, phoning journalists to remind them he was still her husband. But every time she boarded another plane for Spain, London, or Rome, he felt the narrative sliding out of his hands. He began to interpret her success as betrayal. She, in turn, saw his jealousy as weakness. Friends recall a dinner at Curro's where Frank toasted her career but crushed the wineglass in his fist halfway through the speech. Ava dabbed at the blood with her napkin and whispered, "You can't love something you keep trying to hold." The next morning, newspapers printed photos of them smiling under chandeliers. No one noticed the small bandage on his hand. Love under surveillance. They tried to save the illusion by performing it harder. When reporters appeared, they kissed. When they were alone, silence filled the rooms like smoke. Frank began calling her between nightclub sets, demanding to know who she was with. She began answering with laughter, the only weapon left to a woman exhausted by suspicion. One night in 1952, she returned from a film shoot in Africa to find him waiting in her dressing room, drunk. The floor littered with telegrams he had intercepted. "Every man who writes you a line wants the same thing," he shouted. She answered quietly, "And every song you sing sounds like a threat." Moments later, he was gone off to perform at the Sands, his heartbreak disguised as velvet notes. The tabloids praised his return to form. The world didn't realize that every lyric about losing love was a message aimed at her. The world believes the myth. Hollywood, always hungry for perfection, refused to see the truth. When Ava attended the Oscars alone, gossip columns claimed Sinatra was recording in New York. When he collapsed from exhaustion after a night of drinking, his press agent told journalists he had been rehearsing too passionately. Behind closed doors, those closest to them knew better. Their housekeeper once told a friend, "They talk like lovers but look like enemies who missed the war." And yet, beneath the wreckage, there were moments that fooled even them. A night in Acapulco where they danced barefoot on the terrace until sunrise. A handwritten note she left in his coat pocket, "You make the world unbearable and irresistible at once." He carried it for years. For a time, they believed they could rebuild what fame had stolen. But the machinery of Hollywood has no patience for repair. Contracts called her away again. Scandal called him back to the stage. The photographs kept lying beautifully. The illusion shatters. By 1953, the marriage that had been America's fairy tale was running on nostalgia and fear. When Sinatra lost his studio contract and record label in the same month, he begged her not to leave for Spain to film The Barefoot Contessa. She left anyway. In Madrid, reporters asked her about the separation. She smiled for the cameras and said, "Love is like music, beautiful, but you can't play the same note forever." Back in Los Angeles, Frank stood before a microphone at Capitol Records and sang, "I am a fool to want you." The take that made the final cut was the third one recorded after he threw his ring against the wall. The pain in his voice made the song a masterpiece. But those who knew the story behind it couldn't listen without hearing her name in every line. Their illusion, the perfect Hollywood romance, was now immortal on vinyl, preserved like a confession disguised as art. The psychology of glamour. In truth, the world had never loved them. It loved what they represented, the myth that fame could heal the human heart. The greater the audience, the greater the loneliness that followed. Frank turned his sorrow into legend. Ava turned hers into silence. Behind every flashbulb was a question neither of them could answer. Were they in love? Or merely addicted to the reflection of love the world demanded? By the time the camera stopped flashing, that question was all that remained. There is a moment in every love story when the world falls away, and all that remains is two people stripped of their legend, their charm, their masks. For Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner, that moment never brought peace. It brought clarity. And clarity, for them, was unbearable. Inside Frank's silence. Frank had always been loud in public, the jokes, the grin, the voice that could fill a stadium. But in private, he became almost spectral, pacing the floor with a drink in his hand, listening to his own records as if trying to understand the man inside them. When Ava was gone, he would sit for hours replaying, "I am a fool to want you," whispering the words like an apology he would never make out loud. His friends saw only fragments, a glass of bourbon, an ashtray overflowing, the light of a cigarette trembling as his hand shook. He was a man born to perform, but never taught how to exist. For Sinatra, love was control, not cruelty, but fear disguised as authority. He loved deeply, but the depth frightened him. To lose her would be proof that the applause had never meant anything. He wrote letters he never sent, sometimes only one line, "Please come home. I can't breathe without your noise." Then he would tear them up, ashamed of the weakness. Ava's loneliness among diamonds. Ava Gardner, meanwhile, learned early that beauty was both gift and weapon. Men looked at her as though she could save them. But what she wanted most was to be seen without makeup, without legend. Frank was the only one who ever came close to doing that, and perhaps that was why she could never forgive him for failing to keep it. While filming in Madrid, she sent him telegrams that shifted from tenderness to fury within the same sentence. "Frankie, stop calling every man I work with your rival. You know damn well you're the only one who can hurt me." Then, 2 days later, "Forget I said that. Forget me. Maybe you'll sing better without me in the way." Each message became an echo of their love, beautiful, impulsive, doomed. At night, she would lie awake in hotel rooms, listening to Spanish guitars outside the window, and imagine his voice drifting through the air. She once told a friend, his voice could make the dead remember love. But when he used it on me, it felt like a curse. The addiction of each other. Their connection was chemical, almost cruel. They broke up and reunited as if drawn by gravity. Every time Ava tried to escape, she found herself dialing his number. Every time Frank tried to hate her, he wrote another song about her instead. They were not just lovers, they were each other's illness and cure. In 1953, after one of their countless separations, Frank turned up unannounced in Madrid. Witnesses remembered that night as the last time they saw them truly alone. In a small hotel room overlooking the Gran Via, they drank whiskey until dawn. Neighbors reported hearing laughter that turned into shouting, then into silence. When morning came, the maid found 2 untouched glasses of water, an ashtray full of lipstick-stained cigarette ends, and a note left on the pillow. "We can't love like this and survive, but we can't survive without loving like this." No one ever claimed to know who wrote it. Between fame and fear, the deeper tragedy of Frank and Ava was not that they failed to love each other. It was that they lived in a world where love was measured by headlines and ticket sales. Every act of affection became a public event. Every argument became gossip. Hollywood made them believe that passion was proof, that violence was intensity, that jealousy meant depth. Behind that mythology were 2 broken children. He, the boy from Hoboken who sang to escape poverty. She, the farm girl from North Carolina who never stopped feeling like a stranger among gods. They met in the middle of their insecurities and called it destiny. Ava once said to a reporter, "Frank and I understood each other perfectly. We just couldn't forgive each other for it." The letters no one saw. After their final separation, Frank kept her letters in a locked drawer. Years later, his manager found them torn, folded, but never burned. One of them read, "You once told me you sang because words weren't enough. Maybe that's why I left, because with me, you never stopped performing." Another, "Don't look for me in the songs. Frankie, you made me too loud to ever be real again." Her handwriting trembled between love and resignation. These were not the words of a woman who hated him, but of someone exhausted by worship. Frank, for his part, kept her voice alive in every note he recorded during the years that followed. When he sang, it was a very good year. It wasn't nostalgia, it was confession. He could never admit publicly that the best and worst of his life were the same woman. The cost of being legends. They saw each other occasionally in later years at parties, premieres, places where they both pretended to have moved on. Once, at a Hollywood gala, she walked past him wearing a white gown. He bowed slightly and said, "Hello, Mrs. Round. Sinatra." She smiled without stopping and replied, "Don't start, Frankie. Not tonight." Reporters wrote about the charming reunion. They didn't see his hand tremble when he lifted his drink, or the way she turned her face to hide tears that makeup couldn't conceal. Each carried the other like a scar not visible, but permanent. Frank married again, but those close to him said he never allowed anyone to speak Ava's name in his house. She lived alone in London, surrounded by memories of a world that had turned her into myth and then forgotten her. Inside their final silence. In his later years, Frank grew quieter. On stage, his voice was still pure, but between songs, he spoke less. One night in 1987, during a sound check, he stopped mid-sentence and murmured, "Ava used to hate this song, before starting one for my baby and one more for the road." No one in the band understood what brought her name back after decades. Ava, in interviews near the end of her life, dismissed their relationship as a beautiful disaster. But her friends remembered that she kept a photograph of him, not the famous publicity shots, but a candid one of him laughing, holding a stray cat on a film set. The edges of the photo were worn smooth, as if her thumb had found comfort in tracing the man behind the myth. They never spoke again, not directly. But when Ava died in 1990, a single wreath arrived at the funeral with no name. Only a white ribbon that read, "Forever, Frankie." 2 years later, during one of his final concerts, Sinatra dedicated a song to a lady I loved once, and maybe still do. The audience applauded. He smiled faintly and whispered, almost to himself, "She'd laugh at me for saying that." The psychology of their ruin. Their story is not just one of love and destruction, it is about the unbearable mirror fame holds up to intimacy. Frank needed to be adored, Ava needed to be free. Together, they created an equation that could never balance. Every time one found peace, the other grew restless. They were living proof of a cruel paradox, that two extraordinary people can create something unforgettable without ever finding happiness inside it. For them, passion was not a gift, it was an affliction that both defined and consumed them. Love, in their world, was not about belonging. It was about survival. By 1954, everything that had made Frank and Ava legendary was turning against them. The same headlines that once crowned them Hollywood royalty now described their marriage as a disaster in slow motion. Friends stopped taking sides because there were no sides left to take. There was only wreckage, two brilliant people circling each other like exhausted prize-fighters, swinging on instinct, not hope. The final implosion. It began as it always did, with a phone call. Frank was in Los Angeles, alone in a suite at the Beverly Wilshire, staring at a bottle of Jack Daniels that had gone half empty and half useless. Ava was in Madrid, wrapping up the barefoot Contessa. She had stopped answering his calls, knowing how quickly tenderness turned to accusation. But that night, perhaps out of pity, or nostalgia, or the fear of forgetting his voice, she picked up. "Why don't you come home?" he asked. His tone was soft at first. "I am home," she said. He hesitated. "Then I guess I am homeless." For a moment, there was silence, the kind of silence only two people who once knew everything about each other can share. Then the storm came back. He accused her of betrayal. She accused him of needing pain to feel alive. "You love your misery more than you ever loved me," she shouted before hanging up. Hours later, the manager found Frank unconscious on the bathroom floor, the empty pill bottle beside him. He survived barely, but when he woke, his first words were not about life. They were about her. "Don't tell her. Let her think I died." The return? And yet, even after that, she came back. When she heard about the overdose through the studio grapevine, Ava boarded a flight without telling anyone. The world expected a tearful reunion, a reconciliation that could save them both. What actually happened was quieter and far more devastating. In his darkened hospital room, she stood by his bed, tracing the outline of his hand without touching it. He opened his eyes and smiled weakly. "I told them not to call you." "You should have known it'd come anyway," she said. For a few minutes, they were still. Then, almost as if remembering who they were supposed to be, they started to argue again, not loudly, but like two ghosts rehearsing an old script. "You don't belong to anyone," he whispered. "I never asked to," she replied. "But you belonged to me when the lights were off." "That's the only time I ever did." When she left, she kissed his forehead, not as a lover, but as someone attending a funeral for a part of herself. That was the last time they were ever alone together. The manager's secret. For years, people wondered what really ended them. The rumors ranged from infidelity to madness. But when Sinatra's manager finally spoke in his old age, the truth was both simpler and sadder. He said there was one night, after the hospital, when Frank called him at 2 a.m. "She's gone," he said. "And she should be. I just wish she'd taken me with her." The manager urged him to rest, to move on, to let her go. But Frank only laughed. "You don't understand," he said. "She's the reason I'll sing until I die. Every note is her shadow." And it was. In 1955, Sinatra released in the wee small hours a collection of torch songs that critics hailed as his masterpiece. What they didn't know was that each track was a confession disguised as melody. The cover, "A Lonely Man Under a Street Lamp," was not a design choice. It was a photograph of Frank taken the night after Ava's final departure. She didn't just break his heart, the manager later said. She gave him a new instrument to bleed through. The mirror of fame. Ava tried to disappear, but Hollywood refused to let her. Interviewers hounded her for details, calling her the woman who destroyed Sinatra. She would light a cigarette, smirk, and say, "Destroyed him? He looks fine to me." But her eyes always betrayed her. Privately, she told friends, "I didn't destroy him. I just loved him past repair." By the time The Barefoot Contessa premiered, the irony was unbearable. The film was about a woman so desired that love became impossible. Audiences called it her best performance. She called it autobiographical. For Frank, the years that followed were a resurrection. The attempted suicide, the heartbreak, The scandal, all of it fueled the greatest comeback in show business. He won the Oscar for From Here to Eternity, remarried, and reclaimed his throne. But those closest to him said that no matter who he kissed on camera, he always ended rehearsals by staring at the empty chair across the room, the one where she used to sit. The unspoken understanding. They never needed closure because they understood each other too well. He could not stop performing. She could not stop running. They were bound by a private grammar of pain. Every success he achieved was a message to her, I survived you. Every silence she kept was her reply, so did I. Years later, when a journalist asked Frank if he would ever love again the way he had loved Ava, he paused, took a drag of his cigarette, and said, God, I hope not. The manager, when asked what he thought their love really was, gave the same answer until the day he died. It wasn't romance. It was recognition. They saw in each other the same loneliness the world worships and punishes in stars. The breaking point's lesson. When love becomes war, there are no victors. Only survivors who mistake survival for redemption. Frank turned his heartbreak into legend, and Ava turned hers into exile. Yet the wound they left in each other never healed. It became art. The kind that hurts to hear but refuses to die. In the end, their story was not about cruelty or fame or even jealousy. It was about two people who met in the rare air of stardom and suffocated on it together. Because the truest part of their marriage was never the wedding or the scandal, it was the silence that followed, and the songs that never stopped bleeding from it. When the curtain finally fell on their story, the world remembered the legend but forgot the wound. To millions, Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner would forever be the couple who embodied glamour, danger, and impossible love. But to those who truly knew them, they were two broken souls who mistook chaos for passion and silence for forgiveness. Years later, when Sinatra's voice trembled during his final performances, there were moments when the mask slipped. Between verses of My Way, he sometimes whispered her name barely audible, a ghost in the orchestra. Audiences thought it was nostalgia. It wasn't. It was grief disguised as routine. And Ava, long retired, once told a young reporter in London, "People think we were tragic because we fought. They're wrong. We were tragic because we couldn't stop." She looked out the window, her reflection caught between memory and regret. If had been a little less proud, she said, and had been a little less free, maybe we could have made it to the quiet years. But quiet was something neither of them ever learned. They were children of noise, applause, jazz, and headlines, and when that noise died down, they didn't know how to live without it. The manager who had once watched their love burn itself out kept one photograph on his desk until the day he died. It wasn't a studio portrait or a red carpet pose. It was a candid shot, Frank and Ava laughing, rain-soaked, outside a cafe in Rome. No makeup, no suits, just two people caught in a moment too real for Hollywood. He used to say that in that single frame lay the truth. They spent their lives running from that for one instant. They had everything right. Maybe that is what makes their story unforgettable. Not the fame, not the fights, not even the songs, but the reminder that love, when lived without mercy, leaves behind something stronger than memory. It becomes a haunting. And so, decades later, when Sinatra's recordings echo through dark bars and Ava's eyes still shimmer from black and white screens, their story asks us the same quiet question. Is love still love when it costs you everything, or is it only love when it survives the silence that follows?